네, 안녕하세요 여러분. 반갑습니다. 안녕하세요. 혹시 제 목소리 들리실까요? 안녕하세요. 안녕하세요. 해무로동님, 링잘님 안녕하세요. 파월미아님, 좋은하루님, 골든핏님 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 종달새 911님 안녕하세요. 참 힘든 하루하루가 이제 되고 있죠. 네, 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 반갑습니다. 네, 참 오늘 하는 경제정책 회의요? 글쎄요, 저도 잘 모르겠어요. 저도 봐야 알 것 같아요. 얼마나 진행될지는 저도 나중에 봐야 알겠죠. 근데 보니까 지금 주가가 어떤 상태일까요? 이제 애가 집에 왔어요, 드디어. 애가 드디어 이제 집에 왔는데, 맨날 울어가지고, 어제도 잠을 많이 못 잤습니다. 어제도 잠을 많이 못 잤어요. 근데 그래서 오늘도 뭐 제가 할 수 있을 만큼만 해볼게요, 한번. 아닙니다. 집에 돌아왔어요. 지금 와이프 지금 애 보고 있는 상태입니다. 그래서 빨리 하고 저도 또 일찍 자고 그렇게 해야 되겠죠. 그리고 너무 바빴어요. 너무 바빠가지고 그래도 뭐 최대한 또 시간을 쪼개가지고 오늘 또 이제 파월이 또 이제 유럽에서 이제 또 연설을 한다고 하니까 유럽에서 이제 또 디스커션 뭐 회의를 진행한다고 하니까 그 부분에 대해서 한번 보려고 하고요. 맞아요. 선물이 내려간 이유가 이제 경기 지표가 이번에 발표를 했죠. 그 컨슈머 센티먼트를 해가지고 이제 그 지표가 발표했는데 그게 좀 약간 안 좋았던 것 같아요. 이번에 좀 내려가면서 사람들의 소비가 좀 위축되고 있다라고 보시면 될 것 같아요. 물론 사람들이 돈이 많지만 지금 위축되고 있어가지고 조금 안타깝죠. 네, 비타님 아마 몇 년간 힘들 수도 있어요. 근데 와이프가 정말 많이 도와줘요. 정말 많이 와이프가 도와줘가지고 다행히도 두고 봐야죠. 앞으로 꾸준히 진행을 해 나가야 될 것 같습니다. 근데 일단은 그래도 저희 회원분들께서는 어느 정도 또 대처를 했으리라 봐요. 일단 뭐 혹시는 그렇다 쳐도 ET가 반등을 좀 해줬죠. 그래서 제가 에너지 트랜스퍼의 경우는 제가 산다고 말씀을 드렸고 ET는 또 올라가기 시작했습니다. 에너지 트랜스퍼는 충분히 좀 최근에 반등을 해줬기 때문에 나름대로 괜찮은 가격대에서 이제 아마 사셨을 거예요. ET의 경우는. 그래서 ET는 아마 9달러 때 제가 말씀을 드렸으니까 9달러 때 내려갔을 때 말씀을 드렸으니까 아마 그때 대응을 하셨을 분들은 하셨을 거라고 봐요. 그래서 에너지 트랜스퍼는 뭐 개인적으로 뭐 원유 주기도 하고 그 다음에 거기다가 배당금도 8% 넘게 주니까 충분히 괜찮은 그런 이제 투자였죠. 게다가 떨어지는 속도가 굉장히 빨랐다는 점이 전 개인적으로 마음에 들었어요. 왜냐면 빠를수록 반등도 빠르니까요. 그래서 에너지 트랜스퍼 괜찮은 투자였다라고 괜찮은 대응이었다라고 생각이 되고요. 지금 보니까 뭐 원유주 빼고는 여전히 굉장히 안 좋아요. 원유주 빼고는. 그리고 최근에도 제가 분석을 드렸죠. 원유주에 관련해가지고 뭐 인플레이션이랑 좀 연관된 그런 지표를 보여드리면서 최근 영상에서 제가 또 보여드렸는데 원유에 대한 수요가 너무나 셉니다. 그리고 공급도 되게 약하고요. 그렇기 때문에 개인적으로 원유주를 안 살 이유는 없었다라고 말씀을 드립니다. 아마 제가 충분히 많이 말씀을 그 저희 멤버십 게시판으로 힌트를 드렸기 때문에 아마 이 티는 어느 정도 다들 대응을 하셨다고 봐요. 예, PC는 안 봤습니다. 그래서 보니까 지금 아프터마켓 보니까 지금 거의 다 하락하고 있긴 하네요. 아직도 아까 잠깐 반등을 해줬는데 예, 지금 다시 좀 하락하고 있는 그런 추세예요. 예. 그래서 사실 이 내용도 내용인데 사실 주식에 대한 그런 부분을 좀 더 알아야 이 내용과 접해가지고 이제 대응을 할 수 있겠죠. 그래서 지금 보면 확실히 거의 원유주 빼고는 거의 다 떨어지고 있다라고 볼 수 있겠습니다. 그래서 14분 뒤에 이제 할 예정이고요. GDP요? GDP가 지금 어떻게 되는지 한번 볼까요? 근데 뭐 GDP는 사실 보나마나 뭐 마이너스죠. 예, 이게 보시면은 GDP를 발표하는 그 이제 단체가 바로 BEA에서 Bureau of Economic Analysis라는 곳인데요. BEA 해가지고. 근데 2022년 6월 29일 오늘 이제 그 GDP가 나왔는데 이게 third estimate에서 3번 이제 예측을 했거든요. 3번 예측한 결과 이제 마이너스가 나왔어요. 1.6% 마이너스가 나왔다고 합니다. 그렇기 때문에 조금 안타깝긴 하죠. 어쨌든 마이너스니까요. 네, 그래서 일단 2022년 1분기는 마이너스로 보시면 될 것 같고요. 네, 그 다음에 2022년 2분기 에스티메이트 이제 또 다음에 나오는데 7월 달쯤에 나오는데 그게 또 마이너스 되면은 그때부터 이제 거의 GDP가 2주 그 2분기 연속으로 떨어지면서 나름대로 리세션에 그런 이제 그걸 갖게 될 수 있습니다. 네, 오늘은 근데 참 안 좋죠. 요즘 어떻게 될지 잘 모르겠는데 두고 봐야죠. 지금 실제로 나중에 장이 열렸을 때 오를지 말지는 두고 봐야 되긴 하겠습니다. 어쨌든 GDP는 지금 좀 안 좋은 상태예요. GDP는 좀 약해가지고 두고 봐야 될 것 같아요. 글쎄요. 그래서 유일림님 GDP를 봐드렸고요. 마이너스 1.6%입니다. 여기서 볼 수 있죠? BEA 해서 마이너스 1.6%가 나왔습니다. 결국은 마이너스 1.6%로 됐죠. 그래서 참 힘든 시기예요. 실제로 인플레이션이 너무 높아져가지고 정말 힘든 시기이고, 정말 올랐다 내렸다 계속 꾸준히 이렇게 그 변동성을 계속 보여주고 있는 것 같아요. 정말 쉽지 않은 장입니다. 진심으로 쉽지 않은 그런 장세이고, 어쩌겠습니까? 이럴 때일수록 계속 버티던가 계속 해야죠. 버티고 계속 해나가야죠. 쉽지 않은 장인 것 같아요. 발표에 빅스 지수가 상승했어요. 참. 근데 사실 거의 다 예상돼 있었어요. 사실 거의 다 이미 예상돼 있었습니다. 거의 보시면 이 BA가 1.6%인데 이거 세 번째 에스티메이트예요. 세 번째 에스티메이트. 그러니까 일반적으로 이제 GDP를 발표를 할 때 세 번을 예측하거든요. 한 번, 두 번, 세 번인데 이번이 세 번째 에스티메이트예요. 그러니까 첫 번째 에스티메이트 때 안 좋으면은 거의 두 번째, 세 번째도 뭐 비슷해요. 그렇기 때문에 세 번째 에스티메이트 또한 결국 2022년 GDP 1분기가 마이너스일 것이라는 것은 거의 다 누구나 다 GDP를 계속 추적했다는 사람들은 다 알고 있을 거예요. 웬만한 분들은 아마 다 알고 계셨을 거라고 생각합니다. 안녕하세요, 리공주님. 반갑습니다. 오랜만입니다. 여기 보시면 그래서 풀 스케줄로 봤을 때 보시면 이제 일반적으로 어드밴스 에스티메이트 첫 번째 에스티메이트거든요. 2022년 1분기에 어드밴스 에스티메이트 첫 번째 에스티메이트인데 4월 28일날 발표를 했죠. 4월 28일날 발표를 했는데 보시면 이때 당시에 보니까 1.4% 정도 마이너스가 될 것으로 예측을 했습니다. 1.4%니까 사실 뭐 이번에는 좀 세 번째 예측에서는 그래도 좀 줄어들길 바랬는데 오히려 늘어났으니까 1.6%로 마이너스 1.6% 더 심해졌으니까 조금 더 안 좋았다 볼 수 있겠죠. 그래서 어드밴스 첫 번째 에스티메이트예요. 이때가 첫 번째 에스티메이트인데 1.4%가 나왔고요. 마이너스 참고로 2022년 1분기 기온은 그 다음에 두 번째 에스티메이트이 바로 이제 5월 26일날 발표가 되었는데 그때 당시에는 1.5% 정도 마이너스가 또 나왔습니다. 그래서 2022년 1분기 GDP는 1.5% 마이너스 될 것이다 라고 했고요. 그 다음에 오늘 발표한 게 바로 이 third estimate인데 이게 바로 마이너스 1.6%를 발표하면서 2022년 1분기의 GDP는 마이너스 1.6%이고 첫 번째가 1.4 마이너스, 두 번째가 마이너스 1.5, 세 번째가 마이너스 1.6%를 기록하면서 실제로 정말 더 이제 GDP가 안 좋아지는 흐름을 보여주게 되었다라고 보시면 되겠습니다. 그리고 그 다음으로 중요한 것이 바로 제가 이전에도 말씀을 드렸지만 제가 이전 영상에서 제가 말씀을 드렸습니다. 7월 28일 날 바로 GDP 2분기가 이제 발표가 되는데요. 그게 바로 첫 번째 예측입니다. 그러니까 어드밴스 에스티메이트이 바로 첫 번째 예측이거든요. 근데 이 첫 번째 예측 때 얼마가 나오냐에 따라서 GDP의 두 개의 분기가 연속적으로 하락하느냐 아니면은 뭐 리세션이 아니냐 뭐 그에 따라서 나뉘어질 수 있겠죠. 그래서 여기가 만약에 사실 2분기 이게 만약에 마이너스가 된다면은 실제로 2분기 연속으로 GDP가 하락한 것이고 사전적인 의미로 따진다면은 이제 GDP가 연속으로 두 번 하락하면은 리세션이다라고 하는 거거든요. 물론 사전적인 의미일 뿐이에요. 일반적으로 우리 경제가 리세션입니다, 아닙니다를 발표하는 것은 따로 있습니다. 따로 있고 GDP만으로 이제 예측할 수가 없다라고 하면서 하는데 어쨌든 뭐 일반적으로 이제 사전적으로만 말한다면은 GDP 연속적으로 2분기 연속적으로 이제 하락하면은 리세션이고 7월 28일 날 이제 첫 번째 2022년 2분기에 대한 GDP 성장률이 7월 28일 날 나오겠죠. 그래서 실제로 데이터를 봐야 되겠고요. 뉴스가 하는 말은 잘 안 믿습니다. 그리고 글쎄요, 두고 봐야죠. 오늘 발표가 나스닥 영향 줄지 말지 두고 봐야 되고요. 혹시나 구독과 좋아요 안 해주셨으면은 많은 부탁드립니다. 구독과 좋아요 해주시면 정말 많은 힘이 됩니다. 왜냐면 오늘도 사실 그 할까 말까 되게 많이 고민을 했어요. 물론 뭐 근데 이제 뭐 애기도 있고 막 울고 하다 보니까 개인적으로 정말 그 많이 고민을 했는데, 그래도 또 꾸준히 해야 또 꾸준히 또 장을 지켜보고, 저도 이제 열심히 투자하는 사람의 한 명으로서 그냥 저는 뭐 방송만 하는 게 아니라 제가 스스로 투자를 많이 하고 있거든요. 그렇기 때문에 저에게도 일정 하나하나가 되게 중요합니다. 그래서 그냥 하기로 했죠. 그래서 구독과 좋아요 해주시면 정말 많은 힘이 될 것 같습니다. 앞으로도 잘 부탁드립니다. 그리고 그래서 지금 일단 ET랑 뭐 옥시 빼고는 그 다음에 거의 다 떨어지고 있어요. 그 다음에 중국 주식 특히나 알리바바가 최근에 좀 약간 반등을 해주고 있는 그런 상태이고요. 네, 한 4분 뒤에 파월이 나옵니다. 그런데 이제 당연히 뭐 파월만 나오는 게 아니라 여러 게스트들이 나오겠죠. 그렇기 때문에 여러 게스트들이 나오기 때문에 그 부분은 이제 감안하셔야 되겠습니다. 네, 그런 상태이고요. 근데 저는 개인적으로, 물론 제가 이제 그 저희 멤버십들도 그렇고 저도 그렇고 이제 많은 분들께서 지금 이제 원유주에다가 어느 정도 이제 투자를 하고 계시고 그럼으로써 지금 해칭을 하고 있긴 하지만, 이제 그럼에도 불구하고 사실 이런 상태에서 제가 봤을 때는 저는 그러니까 결국은 제가 가장 편안하게 살 수 있는 종목은 개인적으로는 마이크론이에요. 마이크론. 마이크론이란 기업에 대해서 그만큼 많이 공부를 했고, 개인적으로 이제 마이크론을 편하게 살 수 있습니다. 충분히 많이 저평가기도 하고. 만약에 제가 이런 상태에서 어떻게 대응을 하면 되느냐라고 물으신다면, 그리고 지금 아무것도 투자를, 그러니까 지금 뭐 원유주도 없고 해칭을 하고 있지도 않고 한다면은, 저라면 사실 가장 좀 제가 편안하게 살 수 있는 종목이 바로 마이크론인 것 같아요. 왜냐면 마이크론이 2022년 6월 30일 날 내일, 한국 시간으로 내일 모르겠죠. 어쨌든 미국 시간으로 6월 30일 날 마이크론 실적 발표를 합니다. 근데 뭐 실적 발표가 어떻게 되든 간에 제 생각에 뭐 그렇게 크게 하락하거나 그러진 않을 것 같아요. 어쨌든 근데 저는 개인적으로 실적은 좋을 거라 생각해요. 왜냐면 SK 하이닉스랑 그 다음에 삼성전자의 실적이 나쁘지가 않았어요. 나쁘지가 않았습니다. 네, 그쵸. 또 좋아요랑 구독해주시면 정말 많은 힘이 됩니다. 정말. 정말 참, 애 때문에도 와이프한테 너무 미안해가지고 참 그런데, 그래도 좀 딱 할 건 하고 또 끝내고 또 이제 와이프 또 도와주러 가보려고 합니다. 근데 파월이 좀 좋은 말, 뭐 좋은 말 하기 힘들겠죠. 결국 인플레이션인데, 인플레이션을 이제 대처하는 방법들에 대해서 말을 할 건데, 참 좀 걱정이에요. 이 인플레이션이 언제 어떻게 끝날지. 근데 기업이라는 게 무조건 내리기만 하는 것도 아니고 무조건 올라가기만 하는 것도 아니에요. 그렇기 때문에 내려가면 또 올라가기도 하고 올라가면 또 내려가기도 하는 게 바로 주식이거든요. 그리고 실제로 이제 2020년과 2021년에 거의 뭐 많이 올랐어요. 사실 거의 30-40% 넘게 올랐으니까, 그런 부분을 감안한다면 거의 한 50%밖에 올랐거든요. 사실 그런 부분을 감안한다면은 2022년에는 좀 떨어지는 것도 좀 당연해요. 그래서 많이는 떨어지지 않았으면 좋겠는데 버텨야죠. 이럴 때일수록. 옥시가 벌써 다시 $60 이상을 탈환해주었죠. 벌써 그대로 돌아와줬고, 워렌 버핏은 옥시엔타는 계속 사고 있는 것 같아요. 확실히 워렌 버핏은 옥시엔타 계속 사고 있고요. ET는 뭐 전 개인적으로 제가 좋아하는 종목이기도 해가지고 뭐 별로 걱정이 안 됩니다. ET의 경우는 충분히 기회라고 생각되고요. 지금도 저는 나쁘지 않은 기회라 생각해요. ET의 경우는 게다가 배당금도 주고 하니까요. 감사합니다. 좋아요, 감사합니다. 이제 곧 하겠네요. 네, 이제 곧 할 것 같고요. 네, 이제 시작할 것 같습니다. 광고가 나오네요. 예. 곧 할 것 같습니다. 22 포럼이고요. 네, 시작하기 전에 좋아요랑 구독해주시면 정말 많이 감사드리겠습니다. 좋아요, 구독은 정말 제가 앞으로도 꾸준히 방송을 하고 또 여러가지 기업들을 분석할 수 있는 그런 많은 동기부여가 됩니다. 그렇기 때문에 물론 뭐 저도 제가 개인적으로 주식을 공부하는 걸 정말 좋아하기 때문에 앞으로도 꾸준히 공유를 드리겠지만 앞으로도 계속 많이 응원해 주시면은 꾸준히 저 또한 서포트를 하면서 여러분들과 함께 어려운 장에서도 함께 이제 헤쳐나갈 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 그래서 단순히 방송만 하는 게 아니라 저 또한 많은 돈을 제가 투자하고 있기 때문에 여러분들만큼이나 굉장히 주식이 중요합니다. 그래서 저도 사명감을 갖고 이제 꾸준히 분석을 하면서 투자를 해보도록 하겠습니다. 아우 칼마님 감사합니다. 감사합니다, 칼마님. 네, 이제 곧 하겠죠. 네, 근데 지금 정말 애매하죠. 지금 숏 치기도 그렇고 또 그렇게 롱 치기에는 또 너무나 많은 사람들이 참 어려워하고 있고. 근데 저는 개인적으로 한국 주식 유튜브는 제가 잘 안 봅니다. 외국 거를 많이 좀 종종 보긴 하는데 개인적으로 한국 건 제가 잘 안 봐요. 내일 다시 보기요. 내일 다시 보기도 제가 올려드리도록 하겠습니다. 왜냐면은 사실 제 스타일이 이제 아무래도 좀 더 펀더멘탈이랑 기업의 밸류에이션이랑 그 다음에 뭐 재무제표 보는 거랑 좀 더 데이터의 위주로 돼 있다 보니까 이제 조금 더 이제 외국 분들이 하는 거랑 좀 더 맞더라고요. 그래서 저는 좀 더 밸류에이션 중시하고 있는데 실제로 외국에서도 많이 밸류에이션 하거든요. 밸류에이션 이용해가지고 정말 많이 기업을 분석을 하기 때문에 저는 사실 좀 많이 외국 거를 많이 좀 종종 보긴 합니다. 가끔씩. 안녕하세요, MJ님. 안녕하세요. 유가는 계속 오르나요? 제가 최근에 이제 분석을 해드렸죠. 유가의 경우는. 근데 유가의 경우는 지금 공급이 너무나 약해요. 그러니까 이제 수요 대비해서요. 공급이 물론 이제 96%나 이제 최대한 많이 오르긴 했지만 여전히 수요 대비해서 공급이 많이 지금 부족합니다. 그렇기 때문에 좀 앞으로도 꾸준히 오를 것 같아요. 공급이 너무나 부족하기 때문에 지금 인벤토리가 거의 아마 재고 상태가 정말 낮을걸요. 제가 최근에 보여드렸죠. 최근에 영상을 통해서 제가 한번 보여드린 적이 있는데 지금 이제 분석을 앞두고 있으니까 지금 제가 켜드리긴 뭐하고 지난 영상 때 제가 거의 완전 오일 관련해가지고 원유 재고 관련해가지고 거의 웹사이트에 들어가서 제가 세세하게 제가 보여드렸습니다. 그냥 일반적으로 그냥 뭐 뉴스 기사 보여드린 게 아니라 정말 그냥 원 데이터를 갖고 와가지고 제가 비교를 해드렸거든요. 그렇기 때문에 아마 지난 영상 보시면 아마 원유에 대해서 앞으로의 전망에 대해서 훨씬 더 잘 알 거예요.
Inflation is back. And for the first time since before the 2008 financial crisis, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England, along with a host of other central banks, are all tightening monetary policy. But the threats to growth are immense too. Policymakers face a delicate balancing act between stamping out inflation and avoiding a recession. Ladies and gentlemen, for traversing this narrow path, Francine Lacroix, editor-at-large at Bloomberg, will be moderating the session. Francine, the floor is yours.
Claire, thank you so much. Now, we're here at the ECB Forum on Central Banking, and every year it's very clear that Sintra really dominates the attention of investors, but not every year is like this one. Now, for one, it's not, I'm told, quite as windy as it was yesterday, but that, of course, is not what makes this year so special and so unique. We're entering a new chapter for monetary policy, a divergence for almost 15 years of policy experimentation in an age really defined by stubbornly low inflation. Now, this year that has changed. As Claire was saying, our policy panel needs a little introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Jerompawl is the chair of the US Federal Reserve, Andrew Bailey, governor of the Bank of England, Agustin Carstens governed the Bank of Mexico before becoming general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, and of course our host, the president of the ECB, Christine Lagarde. Now, just a reminder, between them, these institutions hold nearly $20 trillion worth of assets on their balance sheet, and they've, of course, maintained ultra-low, even negative interest rates for the better part of a decade with little disruption. They now have the unenviable position of presiding over the great unwinding of policy that may have permanently changed the architecture of global markets. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to have, I'm sure, a robust discussion over the next 90 minutes. Mr. Carstens, let me start with you as a central bank of central banks. You know, central banks in general have faced really a succession of crises over the past years, but also some of the structural factors, such as the green transition, digitalization, and increased onshoring. So how different will the future of inflation be from now on? How different will it be from the last decade?
Well, I mean, a very important change that has taken place in the last, I would say, 2 decades, or even more. For example, we compare this period of inflation with the 70s, is that we have much stronger institutional monetary frameworks and institutional framework for central banks, and I think they're far better positioned to combat inflation. If we go back to the 70s, and 70s have become a natural reference, we were at the time where, for example, the Bretton Woods was failing. You don't have more, I would say, instability in a system where you are, for example, revising your exchange rate regimes. And that is not happening today. I think that the period of disinflation there established very, very strong basis to create new and more nimble, more agile, better prepared central banks. And I think, for example, the design of the ECB, our host here today, in a way incorporated many of those learnings. So, I mean, when you are in charge of combating inflation, what you need to be able to anticipate is that sometimes you will be surprised, because there are many elements that affect inflation and that they are not directly under your control. And I think to a large extent this is what we are seeing today. And I see a very, very strong ability of all central banks to analyze, to incorporate that information and to react. For me, if you look very careful what is going on right now, in the last 2 years we have seen dramatic changes in the environment. We went from having a situation where depression was felt, was feared, deflation was coming, to a very quick rebound with the vaccination and so on and so forth. And we moved tremendously quickly from an environment of fearing deflation to fearing inflation. And that has been compounded by the Russian crisis. I have to say, monetary policy, as nimble as it can be, cannot respond with that celerity. So I think that the knowledge of the new form of inflation is being learned and is being responded. So I'm very positive that this institutional framework and strength of central banks today will take us to the goal where we want to be relatively soon.
Do you agree? I mean, when you look at complexity and uncertainty, has it always been this way but we forget about it? Or is this really a new frontier?
Everything Augustine said about institutional series of supply shocks. We've had very high inflation now across the world, certainly through all the advanced economies, and we're, to Augustine's point, we're learning to deal with it. Our job is to find price stability and maximum employment in the case of the Fed in this new economy with these new forces. And it is a very different exercise than the one that we've had for the last 25 years. Nonetheless, the goals are the same.
So I don't know whether, Madame, again, after this volatility, do we go back to something that resembles the last 10 years, or is it, something else completely?
I also agree with most of the points that Augustine made, and we don't have to agree between us because we always do. But I don't think that we're going to go back to that environment of low inflation. And I think that there are forces that have been unleashed as a result of the pandemic, as a result of this massive geopolitical shock that we are facing now, that are going to change the picture and the landscape within which we operate. If I look at our euro area, for instance, we have record low unemployment. We have inflation expectations, however emphasized and with the pinch of salt that was discussed at the last panel, which was excellent, we have inflation expectations that are much, much higher than they were. That's for the internal matters. But if you look at the rest of the world, a lot of the movements that we've experienced in the last 20 years was predicated on globalization, on the breaking down of supply chains, on the reduction of cost, on the just on time. That has changed and will probably change continuously towards a system that we are not certain about at this point in time, which is much debated. Some would argue that globalization will continue in a different format. Some would argue that the place where you manufacture, the place from which you provide services is going to be determined by different factors than just cost. It will be about cost as usual. But it's also going to be about where do I locate my services, where do I employ people, where do I reduce my costs, and are those areas, geographical as well as political, actually foes or friends, and do I have some predictability about the future of my production or the providing of my services. And the third factor that is going to change the scene from my vantage point is the way in which we produce. And I think that the shift that we're observing in Europe, certainly, towards green transition is also going to change dramatically the way in which we operate. And all those forces are going to produce inflation, deflationary impact that are still to be measured, but in the short run, I have some ideas as to where it's heading.
And we'll get back to those ideas shortly. Governor, do you see this as a sea change for the longer-term future?
Yes, I do. I think first of all we have to say that unquestionably, of course, our task is to return to low inflation. But I think if we see this, every day, that in fulfilling that task, in fulfilling that task, we're observing certainly, what can turn out to be structural change, and some of it I think, I would say is already getting there. So I think COVID is leaving a structural legacy on labour markets in the way they behave, which we're already beginning to see. I think sadly the European security situation is changed. We hope it obviously doesn't persist, but it has changed, and that's affecting, as Christine was saying, that's affecting supply chains. It's affecting the resilience of the whole supply system. You mentioned climate change, Francine. I mean, I would say that this is not, for some people sometimes say, this is not some sort of dilettante activity by central banks. The reason that we're not in the lead on it, clearly, but the reason we have to take it seriously is because it is affecting our world. And actually it will get worse. And that's the sad fact of life. And we have to, in a sense, understand that and understand what effects it will have and how we respond to it. So these structural changes, are very important in our landscape.
But Jeroen, as these complexities or as these sands are shifting, is slower growth, much slower growth, an inevitable trade-off on trying to deal with inflation?
So I would say that if what we see, for example, is the redivision of the world into competing geopolitical and economic camps and a reversal of globalization, that certainly sounds like lower productivity and lower growth. And in many parts of this side of that, you see aging demographics, so a shrinking workforce, and you see economies that are growing more slowly, and those workforces are not expanding. So that's certainly a possible outcome, and I think probably to some extent a likely outcome.
And in the shorter term, can the economy, can the U.S. economy actually deal with a possible onslaught of interest rate hikes?
So the U.S. economy is actually in pretty strong shape. So if you look back a year, the U.S. economy grew more than 5.5%. It was really the big reopening year. And so we had expected this year to be that growth would moderate to a more sustainable path. We also, of course, are raising interest rates, and the aim of that is to slow growth down so that supply will have a chance to catch up. We hope that growth can still remain positive. But if you look at the strength of the economy, households are in a very strong financial shape. They've still got a lot of excess savings from forced saving, from not being able to travel, and things like that, and also from fiscal transfers. So households are overall, not every household, and not the ones at the lower end of the income spectrum, overall in strong shape. The same thing is true of businesses. Very, very low rates of default and things like that. Lots of cash on the balance sheet. The labor market is tremendously strong. Still averaging very, very high job growth per month. So overall, the U.S. economy is well positioned to withstand tighter monetary policy, we think.
But is it automatically a trade-off between fighting inflation or taking care of the economy, and how far are you willing to go with interest rate hikes?
So I guess I'd say it this way: our aim is to have growth moderate. It's a sort of a necessary adjustment that needs to happen, so that again supply can catch up. It could be supply of workers. It could be time for the supply chains to improve. So the sense of that is that if we can get some, right now supply and demand are really out of balance in many parts of the U.S. economy. The labor market being a big example of that. We need to get them better in balance so that inflation can come down. And that's the aim of what we're doing. Now, we don't have precision tools. Obviously, monetary policy famously a blunt tool. That is our aim, that is our intention. We think that there are pathways for us to achieve that, to achieve the path back to 2% inflation while still sustaining a strong labor market. We believe we can do that. That is our aim. There's no guarantee that we can do that. It's obviously something that's going to be quite challenging, and I would also say that the events of the last few months have made it significantly more challenging. Thinking there particularly of the war in Ukraine, which has added tremendously to inflationary pressures around food and energy commodities and agricultural chemicals and industrial chemicals and things like that. So it's gotten harder, the pathways have gotten narrower. Nonetheless, that is our aim, and we believe that there are pathways to achieve that.
President Lagarde, can you talk to us about this fine balancing act for Europe and what that means?
What I find extraordinary is that sort of 10-15 minutes into this debate, we're having to really use the word energy. And certainly in this part of the world, the energy shock that we have suffered, are suffering, and probably will continue to suffer, has had a major impact. And I think this is not specific to Europe, but there is certainly a dependency of European countries, and the euro area is certainly a point in the case, to external supply from foes. And that has had a major impact on prices. It is certainly a very driving force, a strong driving force of the inflation that we have experienced in the last few months. This has been, as you said, Jay, exacerbated by the war. And I think the proximity inflation expectations, as was discussed earlier. But we also have, that then is a series of supply shocks that are hitting the European economy. But we also have this recovery that is very much underway, that is certainly driven by services because of the swing that we've observed from goods to services, and which is also supporting the economy. We have very low unemployment numbers, high employment participation. Some of it is more attributable to public service jobs than private sector, although that is also back to pre-pandemic moments. And we have a couple of other items, such as significant savings that are still to be used, hopefully, or not. And we have fiscal policy. And the fiscal policy that we are seeing at the moment is roughly in the range of 1% GDP. But we need to see how fiscal authorities move, where they move, and we certainly hope that they will move in a targeted, temporary way in order to make sure that they support the most vulnerable and not in a broad and discriminated fashion as we have unfortunately observed so far.
And why do you prefer actually the more gradual approach? So yesterday you reiterated 25 basis points
Gradual
higher.
for monetary policy?
For monetary
Well,
policy.
don't forget, I didn't say gradual full stop. I said gradual but optional. And I think it's a combination of the two that actually matters for us. Moving gradually is certainly appropriate in times of very high uncertainty, but as the uncertainty will clear in various accounts, we will have to certainly be less gradual and give more weight to optionality. But we have both of them in combination at the moment, optionalities being also a very critical aspect of our determination.
Mr. Krosno, you've been pretty vocal actually on what central banks should do. Do you think they need to cut faster?
Well, I think everyone should react according to their own circumstances. What is very satisfactory at this stage is that pretty much all central banks have starting address the issues. One way of dealing with it is through words, to recognizing you have a problem, to saying that you will address it, and pretty much all have already entered into the field of action. So central banks have been acting in consequence. I have to say the level of interest rates worldwide have adjusted. The level of interest rates, if you look them from the yield curves, they have been increasing quite substantially. What we can say is that global financial conditions have tightened substantially, because we don't have to. We shouldn't forget that this, in a way, has become a global phenomenon. Inflation around the world has been increasing. Now, each country, as Christine and Andrew J. have been saying, each one face different dynamics of inflation. In a way, I think what is very, very important is that in the realm of their own economies, what they should try to do is at some point prevent a full transition from a low inflation environment to a high inflation environment where this high inflation gets entrenched. And for that, basically, you need to prevent these vicious cycles to kick in. And pretty much all of them are addressing it. In these vicious cycles, labor markets are very important, and labor markets are very different across the world. Therefore, I think that there is no one recipe or no one remedy for all. But what I'm seeing is that pretty much all central banks have been addressing the issue in a forceful, determined way according to their own circumstances.
Mr. Custon, does it mean that you would be in favor of front-loading hikes so that it's a powerful message, maybe to people, for a lot of the citizens?
Well, let me give you a good example, and to introduce a little bit of a different flavor here. I come from emerging markets, and if you see how emerging markets have been acting this time around compared to other periods of very high interest rate increases in advanced economies, or the expectations of fast increases in interest rates, they have acted quite well. You know, I mean, if you see the more recent episode was the temper tantrum, where many emerging markets suffered dramatically with the expectation of higher interest rates. My own country, Mexico, several of our crises have been associated with rapid increases in US interest rates, but we have learned our lesson. And so what you see is emerging markets traditionally were the ones who would increase interest rates at the very end. Now they started very early on. And what you can see is that they have managed to keep their exchange rates quite stable. Traditionally, in emerging markets, exchange rates was a very important source of inflation. So now they're still facing the sources of inflation from the commodity shocks, from energy, from world aggregate demand, but not the ones that could have been inflicted by the movement in the exchange rate. So there you see that the different central banks can act at different pace. For them, it really was critical to act forcefully and very early on in the game. But that's not the circumstances you see around. So I mean, I would say that each central bank is playing its own game because it's different circumstances.
Governor Bailey, does the guidance from the BOE on moving forcefully actually open the door for 50 basis points?
Well, I think the way I would frame that, it very much goes back to what the others have been saying, is, and as Christine was saying, we are being hit by a very large national real income shock, which is coming from outside. There is uncertainty around two parts of that in terms of monetary policy. One is, of course, the eventual scale of it, because it's unfortunately still evolving. Secondly, the impact of it, precisely how it passes through into the economy and what the effects of it are. But the scale of the shock is very substantial, and in and of itself it will have an effect, a big effect, because it will reduce domestic demand and it will pass through into the labour market and it will pass through into inflation. Monetary policy has, of course, a very important role to play because it will act alongside that shock. And it's very important, as we said, and this is where we come to the language that we use, that it, of course, it is there also to tackle the second round effects as they come through price setting and wage setting. So the message that we gave and was in the language of our last meeting, as you rightly said, was that if we see greater persistence of inflation, that's second round effects, then we will act more forcefully. We will have to act more forcefully. Now, in terms of your precise question, what does that mean? Well, of course, I'm not going to say what it means at our next meeting, because our next meeting is still a month away. A lot will happen between then. What I would say to you is that, of course, it leaves options on the table, and that's very deliberate. Very deliberate. I mean, I want people to take a message away from that. It's quite clear that as we respond to this shock, we want to have those options on the table for precisely the reason that Agustin has just said. There will be circumstances in which we will have to do more. We're not there yet in terms of the next meeting, we're still a month away, but that's on the table. But you shouldn't assume it's the only thing on the table, that's the key point.
But Governor, for you personally, would you be leaning towards 50 basis points?
No, because I'm going to see what happens in the next month. I'm afraid one thing that is omnipresent in our system is that we make policy meeting by meeting, and there's always another meeting. If you can only guarantee one thing in monetary policy, it is that there's another meeting.
Yeah. Is it actually annoying that markets or reporters always try and understand, some of this very personal thinking on interpretation, for example? Chair J. Powell, I tried my luck with Governor Bailey, but how do we, how should we be thinking about this? Like, is it, markets or reporters trying to really always get just that nugget piece of news?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot of that going on, I would say. But no, I guess I would tend to put a more constructive spin on it. The markets and market participants are always wondering what we're going to do. They're always wondering what we're thinking. And when market moves happen, that's really a constructive thing. It's never going to be exactly what we're thinking, but nonetheless, it's constructive that the market, in effect, is doing your work for you if it correctly understands your reaction function. So that's maybe a more constructive thing.
And is it correctly understanding what you're saying right now?
So I would say, by and large, I think since last fall when we pivoted to raise rates and get where we are now, since then markets have been pretty well aligned. I wouldn't bless any particular day, for example, but pretty well aligned with where we're going. And right now, the market pricing is pretty close to where the summary of economic projections from 2 weeks ago was. So my colleagues and I wrote down numbers for the end of this year for our policy rate between 3 and 3.5%. And markets are broadly right in that space somewhere. And then for next year, between 3.5 and 4%. So broadly speaking, I think it's working. And everything we say in terms of forward guidance, to your point, is always going to be conditional on the things that happen between now when you give the guidance and when the actual event happens. And sometimes markets can forget about the conditionality part.
But is there a problem actually with forward guidance in this kind of environment because it gets priced in straight away? So it feels sometimes like markets lead and central banks follow because of the forward guidance.
It doesn't really feel that way at all from where I'm sitting. It feels quite the opposite. As I said, I think people will look back on this period and say that we were able to have financial conditions tighten quite substantially, and we've only had 3 meetings at which we raised rates. Nonetheless, the forward rate curve is pricing in, a rate path that looks a whole lot like the summary of economic projections that my colleagues and I submitted in June. So that's a good thing. That's the market understanding and finding credible what we're writing down. And of course, it's all highly conditional, but nonetheless, I'd say that's a positive thing.
Yeah. Do you agree, Madam Again? Is it a positive?
Yeah, I would agree. From our vantage point, we are on a normalization path. We have signaled that very clearly. We've started that back in December, and the key assessment is the assessment of the medium-term outlook. The variables that we look at, the data that we look at, I think everyone is aware of that. And most people operate on the basis of the same data, the same information. And I think that our reaction function is what matters. And as long as that is understood, the fact that we are on this normalization path, that we are gradual but optional, that we're going to be data dependent, we've indicated very clearly what's likely to happen in July. Yes. What's likely to happen in September? Yes. And in the path that we are on, I think that markets have full understanding and appreciation of what we are doing, how we're doing it, and then the level of uncertainty as it clears will probably help us towards this optionality that I was describing earlier on.
Governor, do you agree actually with the market function so far? Have they broadly understood what the central bank's trying to do?
Yes, I think they have. I think the tricky thing that you see, so I would say we see, is that we can obviously see direct market pricing, an applied market curve which prices in what we're going to do. We also, as you probably know, and we just started doing this recently, publish a market survey at the same time as the meetings, and that actually shows a lower path of rates. So we spend quite a bit of time understanding the difference between those two. I don't think it's actually hard to explain, because I think the underlying reason is that the market curve prices in the risk, and the risk is on the upside, and I would agree with that. So whereas the survey is a straightforward point number, the curve's got a risk in it. So I think for me the best way to look at that difference is the risk. But that is a risk in that sense. It's important to see that, get that perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
Not to get ahead of ourselves or to have to become big-headed about it, but there's a point that was made in the previous panel, which we all agreed over lunch, which is that it's not a science what we're doing. There's an element of art, and now whether you characterize it as art or not, but it is not just driven by sciences, and we know that models have had their shortfalls, particularly turning points. So there is also that element that is sort of privy to the deliberations that we have in our various governing councils and FOMCs and what have you.
Yeah. Yes.
Could I just add, we're talking a lot about markets and how we react to markets. Actually, to Christine's point, the way we're thinking about it is what policy setting do we need to put down to achieve the real economy goals that we're working on. That's what we're not thinking, well, let's try to match up with the markets. We're thinking, what's the right policy based on our the incoming data and the evolving outlook and all those things that will get us to 2% inflation while ideally keeping the labor market strong. so much about markets, I wouldn't want people to think that that's actually what we're aiming for.
We still have an hour on the panel, so we have time. Is there a piece of the? I mean, do you worry about yield curve inversion though? Is there a piece of that makes you worry, or do you just
So I would say this: we monitor a broad range of financial conditions. Honestly, the shape of the yield curve is not a top line worry for right now. Our focus is very intensely on setting policy in order to get inflation down to 2%. That's what we're working on. We understand that that's our primary focus right now. The labor market, of course, is extremely tight in the United States. So, so our focus is getting inflation under control. And it's very important that people understand how committed we are to doing that. And that again, that's what we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the real economy and inflation in a second. But Mr. Carson, what do you make of some of the what we've seen in market volatility? Is it just a readjustment? Is it a misunderstanding? Is there something that could turn uglier?
Well, markets are responding also to the circumstances. I think as policymakers to some extent have been surprised because there have been news that really are news and that were very difficult to anticipate. Markets are doing the same. And we have to, you know this very well, markets are turning around very big positions. They're adjusting their portfolios. We're talking about the circumstance where for very, very long period of time, we had tailwinds in the bond markets. We had very low falling real rates of interest, falling nominal interest rates. So trading bonds was relatively simple. We had very big expectations for earnings into the future, a lot of interest in different sectors of the economy. Therefore, it was easy sailing for quite some time. But the world has changed. The world that investors are facing and the world that we are facing. And central banks need to do their work, not as an objective in itself, but as all these central bankers have been saying, to fix a problem, which is inflation, and then continue with a much better world moving forward. So there are certain circumstances in markets where frictions are bigger. Trading conditions are not always the same. I mean, you get circumstances of crowded trades because at some point the same type of investors are trying to do the same operation and liquidity is not necessarily there. Something that for me has been very positive is that central banks, the leading central banks, have been able to implement their money policy adjustments without really generating such big, any sort of market disruptions. Markets have been performing well, liquidity is there, market making is going forward. Yes, there have been some disruptions. I'm not talking about the cyber world, that's another fish, or how do you say it, another kettle of fish. But I think that the markets have been working really well. And yes, behind the actions of central bank, there is always the concern that markets should be working adequately, because you don't want to have financial instability. At the same time, you need markets working well for the transmission of monetary policy. And so far, I would say so good.
Yeah. At what point, and I think that maybe the last point on markets is how much do central banks need to deal with markets, Mr. Carson, to see, to I guess impact the real economy?
That's for
you.
you.
Yeah.
How much do we deal with them? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, how much do you need to focus on markets to make sure that also the real economy is quite strong?
Well, I mean, we spend a lot of time analysing markets, and all of that is fed into what impact those changes have on the inflation outlook. I mean, that's why we do it. With the second objective, as Agustin rightly says, of course, about market stability, because after all, we've also got financial stability obligations and responsibilities. I mean, I think, I'll go back to the panel this morning very briefly. I think the point was rightly made that it's turning points that are the hardest often to read, and it's not just for us, it's for markets as well. And I think so. I look at the UK economy at the moment. it's very clear that the economy is now starting to slow. We are at something of a turning point in that respect, and I think the fact that markets are having to take that on board and that the data can be quite choppy at that sort of point in time is reflected in some of the short-run movements in markets. Now, I do think one of the essential things for central banks is to look through that short run. We have to extract the information and then look through it, because obviously our objectives are much further forward in that sense, in terms of low inflation and returning to target. But in terms of taking the information out of markets, it's a very important activity for us.
Chair Powell, Paul Krugman, I think on Friday, said that the number one risk to the US economy is that the Fed could overdo it because inflation could come down as quickly as it went up. Is that really possible?
Well, we'd certainly welcome inflation coming down more quickly than expected, and we would take that into account in our policy. So as I mentioned earlier, we're very strongly committed to using our tools to get inflation to come down. The way to do that is to slow down growth, ideally keep it positive, and as I mentioned, supply and demand get back into balance. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Is there a risk that we would go too far? Certainly there's a risk. But I would agree that it's the biggest risk to the economy. I think the bigger mistake to make, let's put it that way, would be to fail to restore price stability. And it's what Augustine was speaking to earlier, a low inflation environment or regime is what we've had. That is one in which inflation is low and no one pays any attention to inflation, and that's called rational inattention because it doesn't matter. When there's a big inflation spike, if it's going to go away, we would ignore it and sort of play through it because it'll go away and it won't affect people's understanding. But to the extent there are a series of shocks, it does become rational for people to pay more and more attention. And I think the clock is kind of running on, how long will you remain in a low inflation regime where most of the changes in inflation are actually idiosyncratic as opposed to broadly across the macroeconomy. So the risk is that because of a multiplicity of shocks, you start to transition into a higher inflation regime. And our job is literally to prevent that from happening, and we will prevent that from happening. We will not allow a transition from a low inflation environment into a high inflation environment.
Is there a point where actually inflation expectations get de-anchored?
That's another way of saying it or thinking about it. It's the same thing, the same idea. And the thing is, you never really know. There's no way to know in real time. We all study inflation expectations very carefully. And if you look across the broad scope of short, medium, and long-term expectation, you'd still say that we have credibility, that they're well anchored. But there's a clock running here where we have high inflation running now for more than a year. And no one should assume it would be bad risk management to just assume that those longer-term inflation expectations will remain anchored indefinitely in the face of persistent high inflation. So we're not doing that. As a risk management matter, we're working very hard on the part that we can affect, which is the demand side. We can't affect the supply side, really. But we can affect the large parts of the U.S. economy where there's surplus demand, and that's really our focus.
Is there a data point that you watch for to actually see whether there is a de-anchoring market, or where do you see it first, basically, if it spirals?
That is not to see it at all. We can't. Once we start seeing that, the cost of dealing with higher inflation goes up so much to the extent you find yourself in a higher inflation regime. You just can't allow it to happen. So if you're starting to see serious de-anchoring of longer-term inflation expectations, then you're behind. And I think right now we're doing what we need to do, which is to move expeditiously and into restrictive territory fairly quickly. I think that's what we need to be doing so that we don't find ourselves in that situation.
President Lagarde, what's the situation like in Europe? We had a pretty ugly CPI number from Spain this morning.
Yeah, numbers from Germany that are below what economists expected. So I think it's a question of waiting until the 1st of July when we have the consolidated number for the whole of the euro area, and we'll see, because we are data dependent. But just like Jay, our mission, our mandate, our job is to provide price stability, which we have defined as 2%. So we currently have inflation at forecast 6.8 for this year, moving down to 3.5 and 2.1 in 24. All of that is above target throughout the whole projection period, and we need to do what we have to do, which is to bring it horizon is going to clear. And I think that in that respect, what happens on the energy front, what happens on the war front, unfortunately, what happens in relation to wage negotiations, and how inflation expectations continue to stay anchored as they have re-anchored, are some of the elements that we will be looking at very carefully in the job that we have to do to bring inflation back to 2% over the medium term. That's the same determination.
Yeah, Governor Bailey?
Well, I agree. I mean, like Christine, I am concerned about how the war front and the energy supply front is going to evolve. I think that is the major risk. I think, by the way, as I say, we had an inflation number out last week. What I thought is that on the surface it was pretty much in line with what we expected. Underneath the surface there was a sign that we saw a shift in the makeup of inflation from the goods supply shock to the energy and food shock, which I would sort of characterise as the post-COVID supply chain shock, moving more sadly into the Russia-Ukraine world. And obviously we watch that very, very, very carefully as we go through the year. As we've said in our last monthly policy report, unfortunately there is going to be a further step up in UK inflation later this year, because that's a product of the way the energy price cap and domestic energy prices are set based on the data that we've observed over the last few months, and we have to take that into account. But as Christine and Jay have said, the key for us is to bring inflation back down to target, and that's what we will do.
I mean, hindsight is a beautiful thing, I know, and I also know the ECB published a paper and saying, what you got wrong on inflation. But going forward, Mr. Carson, how do we need to look at inflation differently? So, for example, in the US, and I'll ask the same to Chair Powell, the stimulus, did we miscalculate the impact this would have on inflation? Yes.
I think it's a very healthy exercise to actually assess why you were off the mark. And if all of you actually do the same exercise, you will probably realize for most of you that actually energy was vastly underestimated, and that bottlenecks were also expected to clear much faster than everybody had expected. And I don't think the ECB is alone on that count. We're the first ones to acknowledge it publicly, but I think it's a good exercise.
No, I mean, in the previous panel, for example, if you look also into recent annual economic reports, you see that, for example, some very, very long-term held key components of the toolbox that we had to analyze inflation has not turned out to be so reliable. Like, for example, the traditional Phillips curve. That has been a workhorse for all of us. That, to some extent, had kept, I would say, for some time, giving the indication that inflation could not rise that fast. We faced many limitations like that. I mean, I have to be very transparent. Last year, we tried to crank out some numbers of inflation, and we put them out there. And here's one of the researchers that did the job, and he had the hard time cranking up higher numbers as much as he tried. And we had it at the end of the day wrong. And part of it, I mean, I'm not blaming it to him, no? It was my responsibility too. But that was the toolbox we had, no? Now we find that, there are many different hidden relationships or very key aspects about inflation expectations, expectation formations, situation in labor markets that can give you non-linearities, Therefore, we have a very nice model for normal circumstances, but as it has been said periodically here or in a reiterative fashion, turning points is what is very, very difficult. So we have entered into dynamics that are very different. So I think where there needs to be a lot of work and we started doing some of that job recently in the BIS, is to understand much better what is happening with inflation under the hood. Why some relative prices eventually become more contagious, to use that word, and start spreading around. Why some shocks are more perdurable than others. Why there are some prices that generate more spillovers. What determines the frequency of firms' revision of their prices, which certainly increases with inflation. The new technology that we have talked about, I mean, now we have Amazon and we have all these markets that probably were not there, certainly were not there when the CPIs were calculated a few years ago. So there is a lot of things that we need to catch up. So I think it's a challenge for us. I think as we are accumulating all this information, I'm sure also will give us, and is giving already, more leading indicators of what inflation is doing, and that will be very, very helpful to calibrate a response. So yes, I mean, I think inflation will evolve. The inflationary pressures we're facing today are very different than the ones we had in the 70s, and I'm sure that the bout of inflation we might see in some decades forward will be also very, very different. So we need to preserve that nimbleness analytically to approach, and also be very mindful that we need the right instrument. And another thing that has been very useful is that the different banks have been, the central banks have been able to adapt their instruments to do monetary policy according to the circumstances.
But does everybody on the panel think they understand inflation better now than they did 4 or 5 months ago? Because you could also have, again, going back to Kruger's point.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I believe that you understand it a little bit better, not fully. There is a sort of a big, I won't say black box, but certainly gray box, where I think in the profession of economists we need to do better. And that's understanding aggregate supply. We are, at least I myself consider myself an economist that I was trained under the dominance of aggregate demand. And we know a lot how to aggregate demand responds to interest rates, how they respond to income, how monetary policy and fiscal policy has a transmission mechanism to aggregate demand. But we usually take aggregate supply as given. And it's very complex, it's very, very complex. And I think we need to understand far better aggregate supply. One confusion that is out there today, I think, is that the flexibility or the inelasticity of supply in the short term is there, but that doesn't necessarily makes it the same as a bottleneck. What is the difference? How impact that on inflation? So I think the understanding of aggregate supply that also includes labor markets is of the essence. So from the challenges we are taking forward, for me that is one that is very important.
I like the idea of a grey box.
Aggregate sectorial supply, as we learned this morning with great interest, is also worth it.
Point earlier, and it's very important that we've had a series of supply shocks. This is the point. I mean, the word transient has become discredited, but it isn't really in one sense, because that was built on a single supply shock idea. That supply shock can work its way through. The duration of that supply shock can often be shorter than the response of transmission response of monetary policy. Now, we've not been in that world. We've been in a world where we've had a series of supply shocks. I mean, I look at our shocks. Yes, we had an initial demand shock from COVID, but then we had a supply shock with the supply chain recovery problems. We've had obviously a very serious supply shock coming from energy and the war, and we've had a labour market shock in the UK because those also reduced in size. And it's, as Jay was saying, it's how you deal with a series of supply shocks, large supply shocks, with no air gap between them, which of course feeds through into expectations because put them all together, they're not transitory in the traditional sense of the term.
Sure, Bob.
One way to say it would be, I think we now understand better how little we understand about
That's not
inflation.
very reassuring.
No, honestly, this was unpredicted. I was looking at our at the time of our June meeting 1 year ago. Of the 35 people who filed with this survey of professional forecasters, 34 of them had inflation below 4% for last year. And of course, it was way above 4%. So really everyone had the same model, which was the Phillips curve model, and it just was not capable of producing high inflation. But what it was missing was something that's completely missing in the data for 4 years, which is collapse of the supply side. You know, the U.S. economy is famously adaptable. You know, it has the minimum of structural rigidities, all that kind of thing, and yet here they are. So what you had was very strong demand, but hitting effectively a vertical supply curve. So ordinarily, when people want to buy cars, which they really did because they didn't want to ride on public transportation, rates were low, they had all these savings, the car companies would make more cars, and they might raise prices too. In this case, they couldn't make as many cars, so what you got was straight up the vertical supply curve, a big price increase. But I also think, in principle at least, that process could work in reverse, so that as demand comes down, you could, you know, inflation could actually come down more quickly than would there are other relationships that people think about when they think about how you get inflation down, which are more typical of a simply overheated economy and entrenched inflation, the sacrifice ratio and those kinds of things. But I think this could be, I don't know that it will be, but it could be different because it's just that process working in reverse potentially.
Do you see that process, you know, President Lagarde working in reverse? So actually, I know it's different between
You know,
Brexit
what
and
we're seeing
Russia.
at the moment is more this swing or substitution that was described earlier in the day, where, you know, because of COVID, everybody suddenly decided to stop using any kind of services, particularly if there was social distancing about it, and move to goods. Hence the car industry in the US and you know, stationary bicycle rather than the fitness club. And now we are seeing this sort of substitution back to services where people who've been deprived of restaurants, hotels, transportation, theatres and all the rest of it, that side of it is currently booming and is sustaining the recovery that is otherwise under the various series of shock that Andrew was alluding to. So how these things are going to evolve in view of the uncertainty that we have in front of us here in Europe is something that really remains to be seen.
But how difficult, President Lagarde, is it to, for example, model a gas embargo from Russia?
Well, it has proven. Look, it has proven extremely difficult, and as we have seen from the sort of misunderstanding or wrong assessment that we have seen in the last couple of years, that is difficult for sure. And you know, the rest is for the moment more in the scenario planning world than in the remodeling of what's going to happen on the on gas prices.
Mr. Carson, talk to me about emerging markets a little bit. So first, you know, it's I don't know whether they're coming to their stride because they're used to volatility, but there are huge implications, of course, of what the dollar is doing.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think at the end of the day, a very strong dollar implies for many of them very tight global financial conditions. And so far, again, as I mentioned, the exchange rate, the impact of pressure has been contained, but at the cost of very high rates. What is a little bit concerning, not that it couldn't be managed, but for some emerging markets, this is arriving at a time where there is high corporate debt and high sovereign debt, and therefore some fiscal prudence is important at the time where emerging markets are facing still some very severe challenges. Many of them haven't made as much progress with, for example, vaccination than in other countries. Also, for many of them, the impact of the increase in commodity prices, particularly in food and in energy, is very important. I mean, usually commodities per se, foodstuffs, and energy occupies a much larger proportion in their basket than in advanced economies. So that obviously reflects itself in more social need, and where of course many governments, according to their capacities, they are doing programs to assist people. So at the end of the day, they are on a tight situation. They have to manage things very prudently. I think if we compare this with other periods, emerging markets are better prepared. But I think that the challenges are there. I think a big challenge for many emerging markets, including I would say to some extent, the virtues of globalization have sort of run out of steam, and therefore the relevance of structural reforms are very important. We need to look much better into how to get growth going independently of the use from fiscal and monetary policy. And to a large extent, that also applies to advanced economies.
Thank you. Governor Bailey, do you think inflation in the UK will be longer, will be more elevated for longer than in other parts of the world?
Well, I mean, as Christine has said, we are going to be affected by the shock that Christine described in terms of energy prices in Europe, because essentially it's a common shock in geographical Europe. You said so carefully, because it's a single, particularly gas, it's a single supply system. So although we don't actually import a large amount of gas from Russia, it doesn't, in a sense, the price is falling outside that particular. So in that sense, we're similar. I think where I would, as things stand, expect some more persistence in the headline rates is because we do have, as I mentioned earlier, this price capping system in domestic energy prices. At the moment it's a 6-month cap, and there is a proposal to take it down to 3 months, but other things equal, you would imagine that would put a bit more persistence in it. We will of course have to explain that, because if we can observe a downward path of underlying inflation, we have to be very careful to explain that if that's how it emerges.
But does Brexit actually make bringing down inflation harder?
Well, Brexit, I should say, it's very hard at the moment, if not impossible, to separate out the immediate effects of Brexit and the immediate effects of COVID. So when I look at trade and when I look at labour market particularly, you can see effects taking place, but you can see that COVID and Brexit are having some effects. The reason I say that is because Macmillan for some time now has had a sort of a path of a Brexit effect in its projections, which said there would be a fall in trade intensity initially, and over a much longer period of time there would be an adjustment to that. And we haven't yet seen anything to vary that assumption.
Does the fall in sterling actually help with the economy?
Well, we don't target the exchange rate, let's be clear. The exchange rate is one of many inputs to many influences on inflation, and that's the way I treat it.
So has it been a positive? I mean, we used to say that it was a positive if it was lower.
No, I don't sort of attribute positives and negatives. I'm not surprised, by the way, with the path of sterling for the reason that, as I said earlier, I think the UK economy is probably weakening rather earlier and somewhat more than others. I think that's been somewhat evident now for a few months, and of course it is over the last few months it's happened. But I think in our system today we do not attribute good and bad to movements in the exchange rate. It's one of the many things that goes into the analysis process in terms of how we think about the evolution of inflation.
I was going to ask you about the dollar and whether that helps with price stability, not strength.
Like Andrew, we don't have responsibility for the level of the dollar. That's the elected government's job. That's the Treasury Department's job. And so it's just another financial condition to us. And since our economy, the external sector in our economy is so much smaller than it is for the others here, it's not that important. But the dollar has been strong, which would tend to be disinflationary, but only at the very end, at the very margin.
I think what we're seeing these days are adjustments in exchange rates. But I think the way of thinking of those adjustments in most economies, including in emerging market economies, are part of the adjustment process. I mean, they are endogenous variables. For example, the dollar is stronger because the US economy is stronger, because interest rates are higher, and also how the shocks that are around are affecting the different economies. So the fact that you have a very strong commodity price in Europe with gas and so on and so forth is very logical to think that the real exchange rate will depreciate. And that's part of the adjustment, So I think we're in a world where in most of the cases the exchange rates are part of the adjustment. In some cases, in particularly in emerging markets, it has more of an impact in the monetary policy management, is because the pass-through for moving of the exchange rate into prices is much higher than in advanced economies. So in advanced economies, you know, it doesn't, unless there are huge swings, the impact on the trajectory of inflation is not that relevant.
Chair Powell, Mr. Carson was talking about a gray box. What's your gray box? Is there something that you wish you knew that would help in setting monetary policy? Only one.
Yeah, no, I'd go back to the same thing really, which is what did we get wrong? And that really was looking at these supply side issues and believing that they would be resolved relatively quickly. And then by that I mean there were going to be vaccinations, everyone would get vaccinated, so the millions of people who dropped out of the labor force would come right back in, so wages wouldn't be under such pressure. That didn't happen for a range of reasons. It didn't happen. In addition, the bottlenecks and the shortages haven't been alleviated yet, and then on the back of that comes the new shock in the form of the war. But it wasn't something wrong with our models, because it wasn't in the models at all. It was a question of how to assess the persistence of these supply side shocks. And I do think that there'll be, to Alex's point, there is a lot of work going on to get smarter about the supply side. In the nature of it, though, it was a deep in the tail kind of a risk, and those are very hard to predict and assess when they come.
Because monetary policy is not an exact science, how often do you actually speak on the phone to exchange ideas? Do you call each other and say like, well, I've done it this way?
I can help out. I mean, because part of my job is to be able to attract them to Basel 2 times every 2 months, to have very, very deep and open exchange of views.
We do tell each other not to.
And you also.
We speak
Quite a lot. You're having fun. President Lagarde, the ECB decided to apply flexibility to reinvestments from Friday, July 1st. What will be the guideposts?
We decided. Look, I think if you allow, I'd love to just come back to why that is, because I think that this risk of fragmentation that is much talked about is something that is very inherent to the European construction, and to the fact that we have 19, soon 20, but let's say 19 for the moment, member states that each have their respective fiscal policy, that each have their respective financial markets, and as a result of that, our unique monetary policy has to be transmitted throughout this imperfect market of ours, which has no fiscal union, no monetary union, no capital markets union. And as a result of that, we just have to make sure that our monetary policy stance is actually transmitted throughout the entire euro area. And the two of them, I think I used that word, I don't know if it exists in English, but they are consubstantial. For our stance to be effective, it has to be transmitted throughout. Okay? So to do that, if we see that there are unwarranted disruption to that transmission, and if our stance is impaired as a result, we need to take action. And that is the reason we decided that we would use, as of, you're right, Friday, that's what I said yesterday, we would use the flexibility in the reinvestment of our pandemic emergency purchase program redemptions in order to address the potential risk of fragmentation. Second, we also decided, and it's work in progress, so I'm not going to comment upon it. I know that some would like to have details and understand before everybody else, and particularly before the Governing Council, what the details of that instrument will be, but we decided to reinforce our capacity to properly transmit our monetary policy by devising a new tool that will be considered by the Governing Council of the ECB on July the 21st. So don't waste your time asking me for details, criteria, conditions, safeguards. All I said is that it has to be effective, it has to be proportional, it has to include the right level of safeguards. And that's all I will say at this point.
Yeah, how do you direct
And it
staff?
will be effective, and it will be proportional, and it will have safeguards, and it will be there, believe me.
So how do you direct How do you look at China, Sir Constance? How should we look at China at the moment?
Well, I mean, it is of the essence that things start improving more quickly in China. I mean, certainly we need the growth that has come from China. They play a very important role in the supply chains. I mean, many of the tensions we're seeing around the world could be mitigated by having higher growth rates around the world. I mean, part of the way we have started this conversation was trying to assess, or you wanting to hear our thoughts about how can we bring down inflation without affecting growth. If we have other sources of growth, that would make the whole adjustment process simpler. Now, what is one major engine of growth that has not been contributing as much as it could? And I have to say China. No, they have problems that are well known. One that I hope that can be resolved soon is the one in the housing market. I mean, the housing market has been, or that sector, it's a very important contributor to growth. A lot of, certainly very much impact in the rest of the global economy. And it's a sector where the Chinese authorities have been working a lot, trying to bring it back to its foot. And hopefully they're close. But I mean, I would say at this stage, for their own sake, they're not growing as much as they certainly would like. And certainly they're not growing at the pace I would like them to see growth, because I think it would help us a lot in trying to solve some of the tensions we're dealing today.
Do you think we'll see, Jeroen, more deglobalization and how that will impact our economies going forward?
There's certainly a threat of that, and this is not the work of the central banks, but I do think it would be a plus if we were to find a way for China to take part diplomatically and economically according to a common set of rules, and that would be a big plus for global growth if we could get back on a path to that. But it's obviously that's the work of elected governments, not for us. In terms of globalization, yes, I mean you can imagine a world. It's not hard to imagine a world where we break into these blocks again, and that would be a world of lower productivity and lower incomes over time. It doesn't have to happen that way. People are looking at shorter and more durable supply chains. It's not clear how much of that will happen, and if so, what will be the effects? That could also be, they could be more secure, but perhaps not as efficient as the long but fragile supply chains that we've had. So I think it's a very important question, and there's certainly a risk that the benefits of globalization would be lost, but obviously there were benefits and there were costs to the advanced economy, certainly.
Okay, a question for all of you, and Jeroen, I'll start with you. What have we learned about the last 10 years of monetary policy? Some of the tools that were used, be it QE or in other parts of the world, even negative rates.
So the last 10 years were so far the height of the disinflationary forces that we faced. And really, it goes back before the global financial crisis, but really since the global financial crisis, we had very low inflation. In the United States, we had 3.5% unemployment for a couple of years, or right in that range for a couple of years, and inflation didn't react at all. So we had that gave us the ability to really lean into the maximum employment mandate, and we did that, and I think that was the right thing to do in that world. That world seems to be gone now, at least for the time being, and we're living with, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're living with different forces now, and have to think about monetary policy in a very different way. So I think if you want to know the lessons to be learned from the last 10 years, look at our framework. Those were all based on a low inflation, environment that we had, and now we're in this new world where it's quite different with higher inflation, many supply shocks, and strong inflationary forces around the world. It's quite a
I look at it in a similar way to Jay, and I think the last 10 years have been 10 years of heroic fight against disinflationary forces, with central banks demonstrating great agility to innovate and find sometimes alternative, accommodative ways of dealing with forces that have nothing to do with what we are experiencing now. So we're certainly learning from that period, but we are in a new environment, which also I think will force us to show agility and capacity to respond fast to data that we are receiving at an accelerated pace, and we've seen that it's changing geopolitically as well as economically.
Mr. Carstens, do you think?
But I don't want to sound too dark, because I think that there are also good things happening. You know, I was reflecting on your comments, Jay, and you know, think back, December 20, when we thought that this pandemic was going to hit us for the next 2 years, at least, until such time when vaccination would come to market. And vaccination came about in a matter of 9 months, as opposed to the 3 years that it normally takes. In the same way, everybody expected a couple of weeks ago that the Geneva Agreement of WTO would be a complete illusion, would never happen. Well, certain things happen when there is goodwill, agility, creativity. So I have great faith in human inventivity and talent, particularly when it includes women.
A lot of these problems are happening because the recovery and the expansion of it is so much stronger and faster than expected. If you look at the U.S. labor market as an example now, it's a very good time to be in the labor market. There are 2 job openings effectively for every unemployed person. So people are switching jobs, they're getting pay increases. It's a terrific labor market. The problem is that wages are moving up in some areas at levels that are not consistent over time with 2% inflation. So it's kind of overheated. Nonetheless, it's a byproduct of a very strong recovery.
Government on pay increases. The UK is going through a bit of a bumpy ride with a lot of pay increases. How do you see that developing?
Well, of course, it's a reflection of the inflation world we're in at the moment. I mean, I'm on record as having said a few months ago that, and I'll be careful because I'll get it right and precise in terms of what I said, that I think very high pay increases, and particularly, and this applies to both pay increases and price setting by companies. If everybody tries to beat the inflation, and particularly the version we're having, which is this imported inflation shock, which we just can't avoid, then it will set the second round effects off. And of course, yes, we are seeing some of that tension unfold. I would have to note that rather more people seem to be agreeing with me today than were doing several months ago. But that's not the point. I mean, the point is, yes, I think it was likely that we would see this, but I think I have to say the point about second round effects holds as much today as it did then. I mean, that's the risk. And that's why we will set monetary policy, obviously, to offset those if they emerge to get back to target. We will have to do that, and that's, I'm afraid, the thin code for saying the more they emerge, the higher rates will have to be.
But what sort of pay rises could be alarming for the Bank of England? Is anything above 2% inflation?
Well, I don't think that's the right way to look at it, because obviously there's always a productivity angle to it in terms of how pay is set. And it's very important that, I made a general comment about second round effects, but of course pay is set in a market, and that's important, and it must continue to be set in a market. So it's wrong to say across the economy this is the right number, because it isn't. Different cases and different situations. But I would just emphasise this point about second round effects, which is the crucial point for monetary policy.
Mr. Carstens, has there been an over-reliance actually on monetary policy in the last 10 years?
Well, I mean, I think even going a little bit further away, 2007, 2008, monetary policy needed to respond, to put it in a different way, lack of resilience in growth. And yes, to some extent, policies that traditionally are meant to support some fluctuations in the business cycle have probably been used a little bit more in a more lasting way. And my my sense is the role of fiscal and monetary policy to stabilize the business cycle into the future are getting are hitting limits. In fiscal policy is obvious because there are issues of debt sustainability or can be issues of debt sustainability. And well, now if we had the long period of that where monetary policy would have an impact on growth because, as Christine said, as Powell and Andrew have said, we faced a very, I would say, specific period of time of very low inflation, and where monetary policy could make, if you had the instrument, why not use it? No. But I think what we should learn, and this is not only, I mean, at the end of the day, the economists do not depend only on monetary policy. At the end of the day, they depend on fiscal, monetary, but also many other real policies that are out there. And what we have seen is in the last 10, 20 years, it's a very unreliable process of economic growth in the world. Some, of course, have been distorted by issues like wars or pandemics, but even before, I mean, we don't have the resiliency in growth that we would like to see, and that puts at different points in time a lot of stress on fiscal and monetary policy, and at some point that has some impact. So I think yes, monetary policy will have to adjust, will have to evolve. We are learning lessons, but I think where we need to work more is to understand growth and how can we promote it in a more reliable fashion.
Who doesn't agree with that on the panel? Does everybody?
It depends what kind of growth. And I really think that the determination of the Europeans to focus and encourage investment in the green growth is critically important. If we want to develop the economic potential of any economy, you have to go in that direction.
That's the part of reliability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And resilience.
Yeah.
If you don't.
Governor Bailey and then Chair Powell.
Well, I was going to observe, I mean, the point I was going to comment on following what Jay and Christine were saying earlier about what we've learned from the last 10 years, and then make a point on growth. I mean, one of the things we learned over that period was that the sort of the underlying interest rate, the sort of structural R-star, seems to have gone down for a long period of time, actually, certainly in the UK when we look at it. The question is, what do we learn? You know, these structural issues that we're facing today, what do they imply for it? I'm probably not in the same place as Charles Goodall, because I think these trends are so long run, particularly on the sort of population side, on the longevity side, that they have quite a long way to play out, even on the basis of what we know today. So I think the underlying story will obviously move, but there's a lot that's sort of built into it already. Just on the shorter run point on growth, I mean, I think one of the puzzles which we're certainly looking at on that, though, if you take that sort of underlying story of the last decade, certainly in the UK economy, is why hasn't investment been greater? Because there's a gap opened up between the sort of the risk-free rate and the return and the risk-taking environment. And yet investment has been very subdued. Now, I think the other question we have to ask there, but are we capturing investment there? I mean, that's something we're looking at certainly, which is there just more investment of a non-traditional source, which probably not wholly, but in part helps to explain that. But I think, I see that as an important issue to understand in terms of what we want to know going forwards, because there's no question that investment is, that Christine was saying, in terms of climate change, it is a big part of the picture going forward, and how we solve some of these issues that we've been living with in terms of low investment and low productivity in that case as well.
Chair Powell, do you think we've been over-reliant, actually, on monetary policy, especially as the Fed?
Yes, I do. I would just say, I think that in economic discussion generally, there's too much focus on demand management and not enough on things that will make us grow at the maximum sustainable level, sustainable growth in the longer run. There's not enough focus on that. And that isn't the Fed's job. That's more the job of, again, elected governments, but I'd like to see more of that.
So how should governments be thinking about their economic policy going forward if monetary policy is not the only game in town?
Yes,
Yeah.
So, advice to the fiscal authorities these days. So I would just say, I think when I get asked that by an elected representative, what I say is focus on investing in people and investing in things that will increase the productive capacity of the economy over time. That's what I said. And in terms of, I think what a central bank should do is stick to its knitting and do its job, and leave the major issues of the day to the elected representatives.
President Lagarde?
We have to stick to our knitting, that's for sure. But if we are asked for advice, we should give it. And I think that, to the extent that fiscal and monetaries have worked hand in hand during the pandemic and to good effect, I think we should also reflect on how fiscal can leverage what we do and how we can facilitate it. But we're not. This is no longer the same cooperation, hand in hand work that we used to do during the pandemic. And I would give the same advice: invest in people, invest in green, be targeted and focused, and in the medium term, the fiscal space has to be made sustainable for all countries, certainly in the euro area.
Yeah, Mr. Carstens, what's the correct way of fiscal policy to help monetary?
Well, I would definitely add my voice to invest in people, but I would say more in different aspects that enhance the human capabilities. Very specific. Well, education is one. I think what we have learned with the pandemic is that health systems are extremely important, and I think to a large extent we have invested there. The other thing is that all digitation will imply technological advance will really impose very, very dramatic pressures in many countries, and I think to how to adapt ourselves to that is very important. Climate change, as Christine said, is of the essence in many parts of the world. Incorporating ladies, females into the labor force is very important, and investing more in them, I think it's also of the essence. In many parts of the world, law and order is very important. And so I mean, there is the good and bad things is that there is a lot to be done, but there is a wide variety of areas where we can act, and I think it can make a difference relatively soon.
Well, I mean, Jay's right. Independence goes both ways in our world, and we must respect that, and we do. I think there's a common interest, going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, in understanding why the trend rate of growth has fallen, because in our case, it has fallen. Now, I don't then, the central bank, I'm not going to start describing what should be done about it, because I think in most cases that will be outside our remit. But obviously, we have a strong interest in the trend rate of growth, so understanding the trend rate of growth is an important thing. It's something where we can collaborate. In that sense, I think that's really happening.
3:27, so we only have 3 minutes. And I mean, I'd like to ask you just to close off, Chair Powell, if you're speaking now to the American people to try and help them understand how long it will take for monetary policy to go back to something that resembles normalcy, what would you tell them?
I would say that we fully understand and appreciate how the pain people are going through dealing with higher inflation, that we have the tools to address that and the resolve to use them, and that we are committed to and will succeed in getting inflation down to 2%. The process is highly likely to involve some pain, but the worst pain would be from failing to address this high inflation and allowing it to become persistent.
President Lagarde?
Dito.
Governor Bailey?
Absolutely. I would just add one thing that, to Jay's point and Christine's point about understanding the pain. This form of inflation is even more painful for those on low incomes because it is concentrated in the essentials, in energy, in food. And when you look at the consumption baskets of different groups of income groups of the population, sadly, it's the lowest and the lowest income and most concentrated in those things. And that is very difficult and something that obviously is very sad. But we have to do everything we can because, as Jay said, if we don't get it back that target, the consequences are worse.
All right, it's 3:30 p.m. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for a great panel. I'm going to ask the gentleman to follow me, and Madame Aguel, you stay on stage.
네, 이렇게 해서 이제 번역을 마쳤고요. 또 앞으로 이제 또 그 구독과 좋아요 해주시면은 제가 앞으로도 꾸준히 이렇게 많은 부분들을 통해서 여러분들에게 서포트를 할 수 있도록 노력을 할 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 참 또 오랜 기간 동안 이제 봤는데요. 참 인플레이션 잡는 거 참 쉽지 않은 것 같습니다. 참 쉽지 않은 것 같습니다. 그리고 역시 식량난과 그 다음에 에너지난 정말 어려운 부분인데 하루빨리 좀 전쟁이 끝났으면 좋겠어요. 전쟁이 아마 끝나면은 조금 약간 터닝 포인트가 될 수 있지 않을까 생각됩니다. 이 부분이 정말 중요하고, 왜냐면 유가랑 이 식량난이 인플레이션에서 정말 많은 부분을 차지하고 있거든요. 그렇기 때문에 전쟁이 하루빨리 끝나가지고 좀 이게 좀 약간 바뀌어야 될 필요가 있다고 생각해요. 계속해서 꾸준히 인플레이션 높아지고 있고, 이런 부분은 뭐 저희 투자들부터 해가지고 많은 사람들에게 피해를 주고 있는 부분이니까요. 그치만 결국은 사실은 이 전쟁이라는 것들은 결국 언젠가 끝날 부분이죠. 다만 이게 너무나 길어지면 길어질수록 안 좋은 부분이니까 하루빨리 끝나는 게 참 도움이 될 텐데, 저도 이제 전쟁이 좀 빨리 끝나면서 분위기가 많이 전됐으면 좋겠습니다. 또 좋아요랑 구독 주시면 정말 감사드리겠습니다. 또 참 오랜 기간 동안 또 분석과 그 다음에 통역을 했는데요. 좋아요랑 구독해 주시면은 앞으로도 이제 또 제가 또 영상과 영상 분석과 통역을 하는데 정말 많은 도움과 힘이 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 앞으로도 꾸준히 여러 가지 기업을 분석을 해나갈 것인데요. 일단은 저는 이런 상태에서 정말 지금 그건 맞아요. 지금 정말 좋은 기업들이 많습니다. 정말 밸류에이션적으로 봤을 때 정말 많은 기업들이 지금 정말 많이 저평가되어 있는 기업들이 많거든요. 특히나 여태까지 저희들이 사고 싶었던 기업들 너무나 많이 떨어졌습니다. 이재희님 감사합니다. 이재희님 정말 감사합니다. 많은 힘이 됩니다. 그런데 한 가지 정말 이건 제 개인적인 생각인데, 과거에 주가가 많이 오르기 시작했을 때는 정말 사실 많은 분들이 이제 서슴없이 투자를 했습니다. 비쌌음에도 불구하고 많은 분들이 서슴없이 투자를 했는데, 이제는 주가가 많이 하락하니까 이 인간의 본성 때문인지 모르겠지만 오히려 이제 투자를 이제 더 조심스럽게 진행을 한 경향이 이제 심해졌죠. 이게 참 인간의 본성이라고 저는 생각하거든요. 그래서 주가가 비싸고 막 올라갈 때는 열심히 사고, 또 반대로 주가가 떨어질 때는 또 이제 사지 않는 이런 부분이 조금은 약간 아이러니한 부분이라고도 생각됩니다. 그렇기 때문에 오히려 이럴 때는 좀 물론 뭐 공격적으로 살 필요는 없습니다. 공격적으로 이제 매수를 하면서 살 필요는 없는데, 평소에 정말 사고 싶었던 기업들, 정말 좋은 기업들, 이런 기업들은 이제 장기 투자를 한다고 했을 때 오히려 모아나갈 수 있는 기회가 되지 않을까라고 저는 개인적으로 생각을 하고 있고요. 그런 의미에서 저 또한 한 달에 한 번씩 이제 분할 매수를 이제 해 나가고 있습니다. 그래서 지금 이번 기회에 여러분들도 만약에 사고 싶었던 기업들이 있으면은 그냥 천천히 막 올인할 필요는 없고요. 왜냐면 지금 이제 앞으로 매크로 부분이 지금 안 좋고 전쟁이라는 부분이 언제 끝날지도 모르고 불확실성이 좀 많이 남아있는 그런 상태이기 때문에 결코 올인할 필요는 없다 생각하고요. 다만 그냥 이제 한 달에 한 번씩 월급 나올 때 저는 개인적으로 천천히 제가 평소에 사고 싶었던 기업들 대상으로 해서 이렇게 모아나가고 있습니다. 그래서 앞으로 어떻게 될지 모르겠지만 꾸준히 지켜봐야 되겠죠. 그래서 그리고 전 개인적으로 생각해요. 반도체 부분 많이 하락하고 있죠. 지금 뭐 반도체 뭐 엔비디아 뭐 여러가지 뭐 퀄컴도 그렇고 뭐 좋은 뉴스들이 있는데도 불구하고 지금 이렇게 떨어지고 있는 그런 상태입니다. 그런데 결국은 저는 개인적으로 결국은 좋아질 거라고 봐요. 특히나 제가 마이크론에 대해서 한마디 더 붙이자면은 2022년 때 이제 마이크론이라는 기업이 벌어들이는 매출액이라던가 뭐 순이익이라던가 뭐 이런 부분 있잖아요. 이런 부분이 2025년에는 2012년 대비해서 2배 이상 오를 것입니다. 일단 그러니까 뭐 입니다라고 할 수는 없지만 적어도 앞으로 들어오는 수요에 맞춰서 이렇게 예측을 한다고 해봤을 때 많은 애널리스트들에 따르면은 마이크론이 이제 2025년에 특히나 이거는 뭐 기업이 예측하는 부분이기도 한데 기업에 따르면 2025년쯤 되면은 이제 디램과 낸드에 대한 그런 매출액 부분이 2배 이상은 늘어날 것이라고 기업은 예측하고 있어요. 마이크론 자체적으로는 예측을 하고 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 적어도 이제 기업의 주가는 떨어지는데 2025년에 기업들이 이제 이 마이크론이란 기업이 낸드와 그 다음에 이 디램으로 통해서 얻을 수 있는 매출액이 2배 이상 늘어난다면은 사실 주가는 지금과는 많이 달라질 거라 생각해요. 네, 일단은 그게 제 생각이고요. 왜냐면 결코 이 시간이란 개념을 무시할 수 없거든요. 시간이란 개념이 있는데 시간이 지남에 따라서 이 기업들 자체는 계속 앞으로도 꾸준히 돈을 벌어들일 것입니다. 그리고 돈을 많이 벌면은 그때는 주가 또한 많이 올라 있을 것이고요. 그리고 이제 제가 개인적으로 또 마이크론 이야기하는 이유는 저평가이기 때문입니다. 결국은 그러니까 기업이 미래에 좋아질 것이라는 건 알겠는데 지금 이 기업이 저평가인가 고평가인가 이걸 알아야 되거든요. 왜냐면 지금 이게 고평가라면은 그 미래의 부분이 다 반영이 될 수 있는데 저평가라는 것은 그런 부분이 다 반영이 되지 않아 있다는 뜻입니다. 그런데 마이크론의 부분은 반영이 되어 있지 않고 있어요. 지금 마이크론은 정말 저평가거든요. 지금 P 멀티플 거의 6인가 7밖에 안 합니다. 즉 순이익 대비해서 시가총액이 6배 7배밖에 하지 않는다는 의미거든요. 그렇기 때문에 확실히 지금 쌉니다. 마이크론이 앞으로 이제 얻을 수 있는 시장 4G에서 5G로 넘어가면서 얻을 수 있는 그런 디램과 낸드의 그런 생산량, 그 다음에 PC 마켓은 좀 둔화하고 있지만 그 PC가 이제 고성능 PC가 되어가면서 안에 들어가는 기가바이트 그 메모리 그 기가바이트의 그런 크기 또한 달라지고요. 거기다가 전기장차에 들어가는 디램과 낸드에 대한 양 또한 폭발적으로 늘어날 것이고 데이터 센터에 들어가는 디램과 낸드 또한 정말 많아지고 있습니다. 그래서 시간이 지남에 따라서 결국은 좋아질 거예요. 이게 경기 침체라는 게 물론 이제 이게 뭐 얼마나 갈지는 모르죠. 그렇지만 장기적으로 본다면 말이죠. 제 생각에는 좋아질 거라고 봐요. 이 경기 침체가 뭐 얼마나 갈지 모르겠지만 결국은 기업은 꾸준히 돈을 벌 거라 봐요. 그리고 이것은 뭐 제가 말하는 게 아니라 마이크론 자체적으로도 이제 평가를 했을 때 경진에서 평가를 한 겁니다. 경진에서 평가를 했을 때 2025년이고 그 다음에 그 핸드폰을 바꾼다고 하는데 참고로 4G는 안 바꿉니다. 사람들이 이제 5G를 바꿀 때 핸드폰을 제가 말하는 게 아니라 핸드폰 안에 들어가는 디램과 낸드의 숫자가 4G에 비해서 2배예요. 그래서 핸드폰을 사람들이 덜 바꾼다고 해도 핸드폰을 이제 한 명이 바꾼다면은 그 핸드폰 안에 들어가 있는 디램과 낸드의 양이 각각 1.5배랑 2배이기 때문에 설사 사람들이 핸드폰을 좀 적게 바꾼다고 해도 디램과 낸드를 팔고 있는 마이크론 입장에서는 수익이 난다는 것입니다. 그래서 사람들이 그 오해를 하는 게 뭐 핸드폰이 덜 팔려야 한다는데 마이크론 투자 입장에서는 봐야 되는 것은 핸드폰이 아니라 핸드폰 안에 들어가는 즉 5G 핸드폰 안에 들어가는 디램과 낸드의 출고량을 봐야 한다는 것입니다. 그렇기 때문에 단기로가 아니라 장기로 갔을 때는 결국은 좋아질 거예요. 왜냐면 4G에서 5G로 넘어가기에 따라서 이 핸드폰에 들어가는 낸드와 디램의 숫자가 2배 이상입니다. 2배 이상. 그리고 경기 침체를 한다라도 사람들이 살 건 삽니다. 왜냐면 사람들은 돈이 많아요. 실제로 그 JP모건과 그 다음에 뱅크 오브 아메리카에서 사람들의 그 예금 비율을 보면은 지금 코로나에 비해서 거의 2배 이상 사람들이 많이 저축을 해놨습니다. 그렇기 때문에 사람들은 돈도 많은 상태이고요. 부자들 일단 많다는 것을 볼 수 있는 부분이고 어쨌든 그냥 핸드폰 출고량 그 다음에 컴퓨터 출고량만 보는 게 아니라 컴퓨터 그 다음에 핸드폰 안에 있는 디램과 낸드의 숫자를 집중적으로 해서 봐야 한다는 부분입니다. 그리고 전기차가 되면서 일반 자동차에서 전기차에 들어가는 전기차가 뭐 자율주행 이런 거 다 하잖아요. 자율주행 할 때 들어가는 그 데이터 인풋 데이터가 엄청나게 많은데 그 데이터를 받아들일 때 필요된 게 바로 디램과 낸드입니다. 엄청난 양의 그 테라바이트에 그 준하는 그런 양의 데이터를 프로세싱 하려면은 엄청나게 많은 데이터가 그 스토리지 할 수 있는 메모리가 필요하거든요. 근데 그 메모리가 디램과 낸드가 안 되면은 안 되는 것이죠. 그렇기 때문에 그런 부분도 봐야 되고 그 다음에 뭐 데이터 센터에 들어가는 부분은 당연히 많죠. 데이터 센터에 투자하는 뭐 구글도 있고 아마존도 있고 마이크로소프트 애저도 있고 뭐 알리바바부터 해서 정말 데이터 센터 많습니다. 데이터 센터 또한 많은 메모리 칩이 필요하죠. 그렇기 때문에 정말 이런 것들을 봤을 때 사실은 많이 좋아지고 있습니다. 그래서 지금 정말 미래 전망을 제가 봤을 때는 정말 좋아질 수밖에 없는 그룹이라 보고 있고요. 왜냐면은 새로운 이 수요가 너무나 많아요. 수요가 너무나 많아가지고 사실 길게 본다면 전 개인적으로 편안하게 투자할 수 있는 기업 중 한 개는 전 개인적으로 마이크론이라고 생각합니다. 그래서 이런 것들을 본다면은 괜찮을 거라 봐요. 예, 그래서 이제 편안하게 투자할 수 있는 종목에다가 투자를 하셨으면 좋겠습니다. 너무 위험하게 단타 이런 것보다는 내가 그냥 편안하게 내 돈을 안착시킬 수 있는 종목이 무엇이냐, 내가 편안하게 내 돈을 투자해가지고 장기로 봤을 때 정말 원기업을 모아가지고 한 방에 터뜨릴 수 있는 그런 기업들이 무엇이냐라고 본다면은 저는 개인적으로 마이크론과 같은 기업들이 하나가 될 수 있을 거라 봅니다. 왜냐면은 지금 같은 그런 변동성이 높은 상태에서는 사실은 정말 알 수가 없거든요. 그러니까 그냥 장기로 이게 결국은 투자하는 기간을 봤을 때 내가 길게 투자를 했을 때 선택과 집중을 함으로써 그 기간을 보상받을 수 있는 그런 종목은 무엇인가를 본다면은 당연히 저평가이면서도 미래 전망이 되게 밝고 이 기업이 팔고 있는 그런 제품에 대한 수요가 되게 높은 기업들을 선택해야 되겠죠. 그렇기 때문에 저는 개인적으로 물론 이제 원유 쪽에도 이미 투자가 되어 있는 상태이긴 합니다만 이제 길게 본다면은 이게 정말 2025년까지 바라본다면은 마이크론 또한 괜찮은 선택이 될 수 있지 않을까 전 개인적으로 되게 진심으로 생각을 합니다. 그래서 그렇게 보고 있고요. 그리고 망할 기업도 아니죠. 망할 기업도 아니고 지금 부채에 비해서 현금도 워낙 많은 기업이기도 하고요. 지금 프리 캐시플로우도 그렇고 너무나 좋은 상태입니다. 네, 마이크론입니다. 마이크론. 네, 그래서 그냥 간단합니다. 그냥 마이크론이 팔고 있는 게 뭐냐, 디램과 낸드에 집중을 하시고요. 그 디램과 낸드가 들어가는 분야가 핸드폰, 데이터 센터, PC, 전기차 이 4개의 분야죠. 근데 핸드폰은 4G에서 5G 넘어감에 따라서 5G에 들어가는 디램과 낸드의 양이 약 2배이고요. 그 다음에 데이터 센터는 엄청나게 빠르게 성장하고 있고, PC는 성장률이 좀 둔화되고 있지만 PC의 컴퓨터가 여러분들이 쓰고 계시는 이런 컴퓨터들이 안 좋은 컴퓨터들이 아니라 좋은 컴퓨터들이죠. 고성능 컴퓨터들은 더 좋은 디램과 더 많은 낸드를 탑재가 됩니다. 그렇기 때문에 비록 PC 자체의 성능은 둔화되지만 그 안에 들어가는 디램과 낸드 양은 많아질 것이고요. 전기차의 경우는 당연히 더 많은 데이터들을 프로세싱해서 자율주행도 돌려야 되고 하기 때문에 더 많은 데이터들이 필요하고, 실제로 마이크론은 그 전기차용 그 메모리 시장에서 55% 이상의 시장 점유율을 이미 갖고 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 저는 개인적으로 마이크론 별로 그렇게 걱정이 안 됩니다. 그런 상태입니다. 그리고 마이크론 또 이제 이미 전 세계적으로 이미 그 공장들을 보유하고 있기 때문에 서플라이 체인 문제에서도 그렇게 많은 타격을 입지 않을 거예요. 그래서 이런 부분이 있습니다. 이런 부분이 있고요. 그리고 6월 30일 날 마이크론은 실적 발표가 있습니다. SK하이닉스와 삼성전자의 실적을 봤을 때 나쁘지 않은 상태라고 생각되기 때문에 마이크론도 그렇게 나쁘지 않을 것 같아요. 그래서 오늘은 제가 이 정도로 하도록 하겠고요. 제가 빨리 이제 또 아기를 또 봐야 되기 때문에 너무 많은 시간을 이제 또 제가 라이브에 소요를 해가지고 이제 와이프를 좀 도와줘야 될 것 같아요. 물론 제가 많이 돕지 못하겠지만 조금이라도 도와가지고 와이프를 좀 이렇게 어시스트를 해야 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 여러분들도 이제 라이브에 와주셔서 정말 감사드리고요. 제가 앞으로도 꾸준히 물론 이제 여러분들이 투자하는데 최대한 제가 이제 서포트를 하려고 노력을 이제 많이 할 겁니다. 얼마나 이게 도움이 될지 모르겠지만 저도 이제 그냥 유튜버가 아니라 이제 저도 이제 열심히 투자하고 있는 그런 사람의 한 명으로서 시장이 떨어지는 거 저도 좋아하지 않고 앞으로도 꾸준히 좋은 수익을 내고자 하는 사람 중에 한 명이거든요. 그렇기 때문에 저 또한 제가 공부한 것들을 이제 많이 공유를 할 것이고요. 이런 부분이 함께 모든 사람들에게, 제 채널을 보시는 모든 사람들에게 좀 도움이 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 그래서 예, 맞습니다. 맞죠. 예, 올리비아 비님 맞습니다. 예, 육아는 함께죠. 예, 제가 너무 또 이렇게 또 예, 오늘 연설 하나 손 놔버려가지고 올리비아 비님이 맞습니다. 비님 말씀이 맞습니다. 그래서 저도 함께 또 육아를 하러 또 이제 가봐야 될 것 같네요. 그래서 여러분들 많이 수고 많으셨고요. 또 저도 앞으로 꾸준히 또 서포트를 할 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 정유의 움직임이 이해가 안 가시면은 제 전전 영상을 보시면 되겠습니다. 전전 인플레이션에 관련된 영상을 보시면은 아마 조금 더 나을 거고요. 이건 뭐 단기적인 부분이에요. 이 원유 이 흐름은 단기적인 부분이니까 너무 걱정하실 필요 없는 것 같아요. 그런 상태입니다. 그래서 오늘 그 원유주는 전전 거 보시면 돼요. 전전 거 이제 전전 걸 좀 더 이제 참고하시면 되고요. 전전 영상, 인플레이션 관련된 전전 영상을 보시면 될 것 같고요. 오늘은 제가 이 정도로 하도록 하겠습니다. 그래서 여러분들 또 구독과 좋아요 주시면 정말 감사드리겠고요. 또 앞으로 제가 꾸준히 서포트를 할 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 여러분들 수고 많으셨습니다. 그럼 또 다음에 뵙겠습니다. See you later. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 구독과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. 푹 쉬세요. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 화이팅입니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 즐거운 하루 되세요. 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 리즈케이님, 블루스카님, 비타님, 풀스페이스님 수고하셨습니다. 미국 경찰블리님 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다. 자양님, 신디님, 종달새 911님 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 비타님 고생 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다. 푹 쉬세요. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. MJ님 감사합니다. 수고 많으셨습니다. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. 푹 쉬세요. 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다. 아우 감사합니다. 권찰님 수고하셨습니다. 감사합니다. 태우킴님 유아님 감사합니다. 즐거운 밤 되세요. 남정원님 감사합니다. 구독과 좋아요 감사합니다. 푹 쉬세요. 감사합니다. 수고하셨습니다.